Welcome to Microdose Psychedelic Insights, powered by the Conscious Fund. This is the PsyFi series, discovering the cutting-edge science and research in psychedelic medicine.
All right, hey everybody, this is Gaurav Dubey. I'm the host of the PsyFi podcast, where we talk to leading clinicians, researchers, and industry experts to unravel the mystery that is psychedelic science. Today I have Chris Witowski from Psilera Biosciences, and I'm very excited for this episode. So thank you for joining us, Chris. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and Psilera Biosciences?
Yeah, so I graduated with my PhD in natural products chemistry. So in my research lab, we were primarily focused on trying to find new drugs from nature, primarily focused on infectious diseases and primarily new antibiotics as well. And I did a lot of fungal cultivation there, trying to find unique, diverse microorganisms that grow in marine environments and trying to figure out new ways to cultivate them, stressing techniques because you can't really necessarily get the full plethora of natural products, similarly like psilocybin in an isolated environment. So trying to co-culture more than one microbe together in the same flask to change its chemistry and produce more medicinally oriented compounds. So after my PhD research, I went into the cannabis industry for AltMed Enterprises. They're a multi-state operator, a private company, and I was one of their first employees and their first scientist. And I was primarily tasked with setting up a lot of their processing facilities, all the way from extraction to distillation, purification, product development, and manufacturing. So overseeing a lot of that process in multiple states, as well as developing unique, innovative products and developing a patent portfolio, which have been now approved. And they're now starting to take that IP and license it out into other states. So I was primarily focused on that as well. So, kind of an interesting background, and it's really interesting and great to see now that natural products are making a renaissance. For a long time, they were kind of overlooked in maybe the pharmaceutical sense for more synthetically produced compounds. But now with cannabis, with psychedelics, it's really great to see, and a really exciting time to be involved.
Yeah, it's absolutely exciting. And I think in a lot of ways, cannabis has helped pave the way forward for the psychedelic renaissance. But there's also some major differences, between the two. If you could talk a little bit, having so much experience with cannabis and now shifting into psychedelics, what some of those similarities and what some of those differences are, and how that's kind of impacted you and your work.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the time frame, cannabis and the psychedelic compounds back in the 60s and 70s were pretty prevalent and widespread. And regulations kind of stifled a lot of that research and development for 50 some odd years until recently. So, I would say primarily that's the biggest similarity. They are psychoactive substances. So, I think now we're looking at a new realm of mental health, especially with COVID-19. I think that's going to kind of exacerbate some of these issues, and it just kind of drives more need for new innovative therapies in that realm. But, differences, I would say, psychedelics are a much more powerful class of compounds. Certainly something that in a more therapeutic medicinal sense needs to be administered by somebody having supervision during the process. And, you can't just have a psychedelic experience to have, a therapeutic outcome. You do have to have sort of the psychotherapy administration as well. And, I think you can draw some similarities between, potentially an evolving market towards that. But I maybe would proceed with a little bit of caution because, the types of regulations that need to be administered on a large scale, more, cannabis-like market with psychedelics, I think it's going to be a little bit more challenging. But again, Psilera Bioscience is more of a biotechnology company, so going more of the traditional pharmaceutical path to develop new compounds for therapeutic uses. And really, that's our main focus. So there is an established regulatory pathway in order to do that. And obviously, there are some pretty interesting data and companies that are using that quite effectively currently.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big differences I know for investors with the psychedelic market that's emerging is the fact that it's mainly only clinical and medicalized and there's no recreational component to it, like cannabis. I know Kevin O'Leary, that's a really famous thing he talked about, is he wanted nothing to do with any recreational drugs, but he's a big investor, obviously, with Bruce Linton and I think Encompass Pathways, So to talk a little bit more about Psilera and the race to IP, because that's a big thing right now in this space. I know we talked a little bit more in preparation for this episode. You guys are working on novel methods to deliver like compounds like psilocybin and maybe derivatives. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we have a pretty multifaceted strategy on the IP front. Obviously, looking at the biotechnology sector, patents and IP is some of the most valuable assets that you can create. So primarily that is our focus right now. We are preclinical, and like you mentioned, we are looking at different delivery systems. So these compounds have been known for decades and decades, and they have a great safety profile, which is an excellent place to start for the development of new therapeutics. Where I do think some of these studies are falling short is looking at different formulation options. We mentioned the clinical aspect and having the psychedelic breakthroughs in order to have effects for PTSD or depression. So we're also looking at other ways to make more outpatient therapy so you don't have to have the psychotherapy aspect, primarily microdosed focused.
Right.
Myself and fellow Psilera co-founder, Dr. Jackie Salm, we worked for a long time together in the cannabis industry as well as some of our PhD research. So we're pretty well versed in different formulation varieties that we can deliver, and obviously making those methods suitable for single administration so you don't have the abuse potential that you would for a take-home therapy. And additionally, we are developing a suite of novel compounds, whether they be potential prodrugs to psilocin and piggybacking off some of psilocybin's current research, but as well looking at methods of reducing the psychoactivity of some of these analogs so that, again, we can produce them more in an outpatient therapy.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think a big discussion around this space in drug development right now is the psychoactivity factor and how much that might contribute to the therapeutic benefit. But I think there's maybe more than two sides, but two ways to look at it is the full dose effect, and the obvious therapeutic benefits that come with that. But then the phenomenon of microdosing and all the benefits that people are reporting. There haven't been any official clinical trials with microdosing yet. Is that something that Psilera looks? How are you guys involved in the clinical trial landscape and with your compounds and the work you're doing?
So as I mentioned,
No, that's all. Go ahead.
We are preclinical, so we don't have any ongoing clinical trials, but we do have a animal study beginning at the beginning of next year. And we are looking at taking some of these novel analytes and compounds and dosing them into rodents and looking at some behavioral responses. So head twitch, that's sort of the main assay used to look at psychoactivity. You can also look at other behavioral models like isolation, which would give you a little more insight onto potential anxiolytic effects. But primarily, we are looking at this initial study at reduction of alcohol consumption. It's a very easy one to do in rodents, a very well understood assay. So we're kind of putting all of this together and obviously looking at the safety profiles of some of these new compounds. You can't just go straight into humans. You have to kind of validate into other mammals before getting to that stage.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, man. So, as a fellow scientist myself, I think I'm really fascinated by the pharmacology of a lot of these compounds. And I think it's really cool in the drug development, the way that we're looking to kind of improve upon nature. It's kind of the core of the whole practice as it is. So what are some of the components of psilocybin, for example, or maybe DMT that you're looking to improve upon to make something more marketable pharmacologically?
Yeah, that's a great point you mentioned about natural products. So every year or two, the major natural products researchers come out with sort of a landscape of all the pharmaceutical medications. Over the last 30 or 40 years, they've put out review articles. And I believe now about 58 to 60% of all current pharmaceutical drugs are either natural products or derived from natural products. So it's really a great starting point for drug development because the complexity that nature provides, they already have inherent biological purpose rather than just synthesizing things in the lab and hoping something works. However, obviously, it's not always the most sustainable or scalable method to produce, compounds for large clinical trials or for commercialization. But again, yeah, it's a great starting point. And a lot of these compounds, the natural products, they do lack some stability. If you're looking at just psilocybin itself, obviously you have the blue oxidation into psilocin, and the phosphate group of this compound is particularly labile in its natural state, but synthetically also isn't the easiest compound to produce. The synthetic pathway is well understood, but the phosphorylation step is actually a fairly difficult, low yielding step. So just looking at that particular compound, obviously there's a lot of different modifications you can do in a process called medicinal chemistry. So looking at structure activity relationships of the various compounds. And there is a lot of research that's been done. I don't know if you can see over my shoulder, PCAL, obviously, Alexander Shulgin has done a lot of that work in bioassays. So that's, again, a good starting point, looking at safety and tolerability. Efficacy, obviously a little bit of that is anecdotal, but really what you need to do is demonstrate the full plethora in order to go through the clinical trials. And a lot of these compounds do, I mentioned the stability of them isn't great, but looking at different delivery options. So DMT is one that you mentioned, doesn't really have oral bioavailability unless you have an MAOI inhibitor. And that enzyme varies quite a bit from gender and populations, ethnicities. So, trying to develop a co-administered drug like that through the pharmaceutical pathway is challenging, to say the least. So there's obviously different drug delivery methodologies that you can produce to administer these compounds, not just in a clinical setting, but outpatient. And again, that's really our focus. And we've already done and started a lot of this work, filed a number of patents already, and have relationships with the Neuroscience Institute at the University of South Florida. We're actually a part of the incubator program there, and submitted paperwork to start working with controlled substances.
Yeah, that's super cool. I just wrote a blog on the psilocybin supply chain. I did a collaboration with Cygen, and it's interesting that you talk about that pathway. People are trying really innovative things now, using yeast in like a beer-like process. I know that was a pretty popular story that just came out. So how do you because there's a very high demand, despite it being still a Schedule 1 compound in the United States and across the world. A lot of these firms that are producing psilocybin and synthetic psilocybin are already, all their products spoken for clinical trials and stuff for the next couple of years. So what is your comment on the supply chain? How can this process be improved, and how do you foresee this kind of playing out? Do you think there'll be a shortage? Do you think we'll be able to keep up with the demand? What are your thoughts?
I don't necessarily see or foresee a supply shortage of some of these compounds. Obviously, there's a number of people in the space looking at different methodologies, whether it be biosynthetic yeast or the mushrooms themselves. Quite frankly, if I were looking at producing fungally derived psilocybin, I'd be looking at liquid cultures. It's much more easy to control. You can still produce your active ingredient in a shorter amount of time. However, not a lot of people are looking at that. I knew there is Mimosa Therapeutics, and hats off to them. That's a great way of doing it. And synthetically, that's a pretty renewable source of doing it. The synthetic pathways are well understood. So yeah, I think not so much on the active ingredient supply. There's also a wide range of pharmaceutical grade API manufacturers. Most of these synthetic steps are 4 to 7 steps, so not necessarily the hardest to produce. And kind of lost my train of thought in your question.
No worries. That's why this is recorded. It helps. I'll put a little note for Condor at 11:45. Okay.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah. One of the things I thought would be cool to, unless you wanted to finish that thought.
Yeah. Where was I going with this? I think generally, I think you're going to see potential supply and demand issues once these become approved therapies. Looking at MDMA and psilocybin, you have to have, the cohort of psychotherapists and, treatment administrators, and having the ability to do that in, relatively a couple of years. And I think there is going to be a significant demand. So I think the ability to produce the compounds is there, but administering them in the clinic, I think there could be a bottleneck, but I think time will tell.
That's really cool. Yeah, one of the things that you brought up that I thought was fascinating was how much the administration and the formulations will differ from the clinic to at-home use. Recently, we just ran a piece on how Entheon Biomedical is trying to use IV DMT for opioid addiction, which is super radical, and it seems really like a really novel approach. And of course, synthetic psilocybin can be used intravenously as well, in the clinic and some of these other compounds. So have you ever, what are your comments and thoughts on that clinical experience of someone having such a profound psychoactive experience in a clinic with a therapist, maybe using IV DMT or IV psilocybin or psilocin? What does that clinical landscape and therapy setting kind of look like to you,
Well, with IV, you can certainly, tailor the duration of experience a little bit better. Obviously, DMT is a pretty short duration of action. Psilocybin slightly longer, but still, looking at a lot of other pharmaceutical drugs, fairly short. I think having the 4 to 8 hour psychedelic experience in the clinic, I think, again, that's part of the bottleneck that you might see on the clinic side, and the amount of patients that you can see in a day, when it's going to take one clinician, a full day to administer one treatment. So certainly trying to shorten that duration of action is going to be important. One, to provide more opportunities for healthcare providers as well as patients to, get access. But as well, the longer you're under a psychedelic trip, the more opportunity there is for challenging experiences and bad trips, which, can be therapeutic in their own setting, but I think you're going to try to avoid that if you can. I do think IV, though, is going to be a little bit invasive. I couldn't imagine undergoing a psychedelic experience with a needle in my arm. This doesn't quite jive, I think. Certainly there are other ways to administer and reducing the first pass effect. Obviously inhalation is another method that some people administer. DMT, transdermal is another way to bypass the first pass effect. So while IV, I think, can be effective, obviously you're going to get the drug into your system. There's no doubt about that. It is a bit invasive, I think, for large patient populations.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because the different psychedelic compounds have such differing bioavailabilities. For example, what comes to mind is ketamine. Ketamine is very popular to be used intravenously in the clinic, and with the way that drug kind of works, you're really limited, besides IM and IV, to really get a good efficacious response. But that's not necessary for some of these other compounds, and that can be utilized in other ways. So I'd love to know a little bit more about your, going back a little bit, your being a PhD. What did you study when you were getting your PhD, and how did you first get interested into psychoactive compounds like cannabis and psychedelic drugs?
Well, yeah, PhD in a natural products lab, you're around natural products all day. Primarily, we were focused on marine organisms, so going diving, luckily in the Florida Keys, nice temperate waters. But we also did a lot of research in Antarctica and looking at some of the diverse marine invertebrates that grow down there. And the macroorganisms, the sponges, tunicates, algae, they also produced a plethora of compounds, but we were also primarily focused on different microorganism populations growing from those organisms, soil, mangrove habitats. We had a number of collaborators that we worked with who would screen these various compounds in their assays: cancer, antibiotics, antimalarials. We actually had a grant with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Oh, wow. So it was, a lot of drug discovery and finding new compounds and elucidating their structure, which is, a lot of parallels to what we're doing now at Psilera. And, obviously cannabis being a natural product, one that a lot of people were talking about. In my time in grad school, it was the cannabis movement was just starting. And, I guess in grad school, I didn't really see myself going into the cannabis industry, but it really did work out with my skill set, and learned a lot about different formulation techniques. I haven't really been really great at growing plants, but I learned a lot about growing cannabis. Not that I do, but
Right.
and as well, just the whole startup scene in a very complex industry where you've got regulations, you've got tons of competitors, and again, there's a lot of parallels to what we're seeing now in the psychedelics industry. And going back to some of the research in my graduate studies and looking at various microorganisms and different fungal cultivation techniques, obviously psilocybin is one that I was well aware of. And while I'd say that I'm a pretty happy-go-lucky person, I have had my experiences with psychedelics, and psilocybin was one that was personally beneficial, but certainly I would say my experience with DMT completely changed my life. And that was a little over a year ago now, and it was in some ways, I think, the catalyst to Psilera what it is now. And my experience with it I wanted to understand how these compounds work and how they can be administered. And I think we really are at a precipice of changing mental health and the way we treat these and look at these various illnesses. And these compounds they've been around for a long time, natural products. That it's a really fascinating time to be a researcher, and all of these things kind of combined really were just kind of the ideal setting for myself and Dr. Salm to get into the industry.
That's really cool. So many things I want to say about that. I look forward to speaking with Jackie as well on the podcast. That'll be really cool. And yeah, man, it's really fascinating, the intersection of science and these medicines, and just the ability I've had, myself, is a lot of interesting parallels to my story and yours. I went to the University of Miami, Florida, so I've been diving in the Florida Keys too. That's the first place I ever went scuba diving, actually, and off the coast of Miami as well. And cannabis is also what got me kind of out of the lab and onto my laptop, I guess is what I say, and started creating content, because I realized the need for people like us in the space to help bring it forward, I think cannabis, that need was, with the pathway to medicalization being so clear with psychedelic compounds, it's obviously drawn in a lot of biomedical and companies and clinicians and researchers like yourself. With cannabis, I think that kind of faltered a little bit, in the sense that there's a lot of research and a lot of people out there studying the endocannabinoid system and things of that nature. But there's just so much more of a better understanding of the serotonin receptor and how these drugs work in our brains and our bodies, that it's really catapulted research forward and created a lot of cool opportunities for people like us, in this space to contribute. And I'm super grateful for that. So yeah, it's really cool to hear about people's own experiences with psychedelic drugs, and how that's kind of been their inspiration and kind of helped guide and maneuver them to the space. So what are your plans for Psilera moving forward in the future? Big picture.
Yeah, so we are very active in the lab. So we are part of the USF Connect Incubator. So we collaborate with a lot of different researchers there. They have a really great neuroscience institute. It's actually part of the Bird Alzheimer's Institute. So another mechanism that you mentioned earlier is, potentially microdosing for cognitive disorders like dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And that's another one that we're going to be focusing on with some of our drug delivery technologies and compounds. So I mentioned we have our animals study at the beginning of next year. And really now we're focused, we're doing a lot of medicinal chemistry. We've hired another medicinal chemist along with myself and Dr. Salm to come in and kind of help establish some of these compounds, scale their syntheses so we can start producing them for some of these preclinical work, looking at, all the things that we would need to get to an IND enabling filing with the FDA. So looking at stability, degradants, chemical pathways and synthesis, starting formulation of some of these compounds. And again, looking at all those different profiles of our product to then go to the FDA. And we are looking at kind of a 2022 timeline to begin sort of an early phase 1 clinical trial with some of our compounds. we're looking at a multitude of disorders. I mentioned kind of substance abuse and alcoholism. Alzheimer's is another one that's pretty near and dear to myself and Jackie, as we both have grandparents and parents who have suffered from Alzheimer's disease. So we will begin some early trials with that, probably, I would say next year. And I would say, kind of a newer development that we're starting to investigate is some of the research that's been done at the University of North Carolina and Dr. Brian Ross' lab. They've actually crystallized LSD in the active site of 5-HT2A and 2B. So that opens up a lot of possibilities for, I mentioned structure-activity relationships. Well, you can do that chemically and, bind them in the different assays, but you can also take your protein and change your molecule, put it in there into a computer simulation known as, modeling, computational modeling, and really screen these much quicker and much more efficiently than sitting at a bench, synthesizing the compounds, sending them off for biological assay. So that's actually something we've already started simulations of some of our new chemical entities and looking at the different binding properties and, ADME, absorption, distribution, excretion. So, we're trying to put together a full profile that we can go to the FDA or long-term, I would say we are looking to license out some of our technologies. We know that the drug development process is a very lengthy and expensive endeavor. So we are looking for, other partners down the line. Essentially, once we establish some baseline safety and efficacy, basically through a phase 1 trial, and then we would look to out-license some of the later clinical trials.
Oh, okay. That's really cool, man. I think that's really fascinating, the pathway that you guys are on, and you're helping pioneer a really important movement, for mental health and just for modern medicine. I think one of the really cool things I'm excited about is the neuroplastic and the neuroregenerative effects of these compounds. Like you talked about Alzheimer's, and I had a grandparent die of Parkinson's, and there could be a lot of profound clinical potential here for the ability of these compounds. It's interesting, on the one hand, the psychedelic experience helps us change our mind about so many things, and then they've also shown us in the lab and through research that these old concepts that we used to have, like once these neurons die, there's no way for them to be regenerated. They're kind of helping us redefine a lot of our expectations of what's possible with health in there too. I think it'd be cool if you could comment on just this whole phenomenon that's taking place.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Alzheimer's has kind of been the big thing that a lot of different researchers have been trying to target. And, primarily they're looking at tau pathways. So basically your brain starts developing these toxic proteins and your body can't metabolize them. So they just kind of agglomerate and get worse. And that's sort of the later stages of Alzheimer's. That's once you start to have symptoms, it's already too late and there isn't a way to even reverse some of it. You're just kind of masking some of the symptoms associated with it. But yeah, there's actually research now showing that looking at different serotonin targeting systems, there has been some evidence to show that the serotonin system can modulate some of these tau agglomerations. Neuroinflammation is also a pretty big, indication within the Alzheimer's population. And these compounds are very, very potent anti-inflammatory agents. And as well, you're looking at anecdotally, potentially the microdosing aspects being beneficial for cognitive enhancement. So, we know some of the targets for Alzheimer's and how the disease progresses, but the targets that a lot of these drugs have been targeting aren't effective. So we need to find new ways of targeting different ways. I'm saying the word targeting so many times.
Sure, I get what you're saying, though.
Yeah. Maybe we can edit that part out.
Sure. We're at 11:59.
Thanks. So
you want to pick up? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So we know how the tau pathways work and how it's associated with the disease state, but we need to find other mechanisms of action in order to develop new therapies, because what's currently being done isn't effective. And there's been loads of failed clinical trials on the Alzheimer's side, and when you kind of combine all the different ways that these compounds and the psychedelics can be effective for cognitive disorders, I think really, this is a very promising way to look at it. And actually, you mentioned some of the studies now showing the brain growth factors. So DMT, primarily most psychedelics target 5-HT2A as agonists, and that's where you get the psychedelic experience. So generally what they do to confirm that the compound is targeting 5-HT2A as an agonist is they dose an antagonist, so it blocks the binding of the other agonist. So that worked for LSD, Ibogaine, I think MDMA, but it didn't work for DMT, which is fairly surprising. So it means that 5-HT2A alone isn't responsible for some of the brain and neuron growth. So that's a really, fascinating discovery that just came out, I believe, in 2018. So again, there's a lot of preliminary data that's out there, but trying to piece it together into, an actionable, discoverable therapeutic is, that's going to take some time, but, we're more than happy and engaged and ready to put our compounds to work.
Yeah, dude, it's really the perseverance that people have towards psychedelic research and science in this field right now is really amazing to see, because there's a lot we know, like we talked about, especially in comparison to cannabis, but there's still so much that we don't know, and
yeah.
there's the different flavors of psychedelic experiences and how that translates to the mechanisms of action, like what you just talked about with DMT, is so fascinating, like it doesn't just come down to the 5-HT2A receptor, like we thought it did for so many of the traditional serotonergics, and I think that's really cool.
Yeah, and this might be a little off topic, but I think it's relevant to the discussion. So if you look at some of the Johns Hopkins studies with psilocybin, and they correlate basically the antidepressive effect with essentially the mystical experience. So the greater the psychedelic effect, the greater the antidepressive effect. And obviously some level of consciousness is involved in the neuroplastic changes that you've mentioned. But if you look at sort of the starting point for a lot of these compounds in the clinical development, it's in rodents. And there's a lot of data out there to suggest that rodents don't have any form of consciousness, but psilocybin still has the same level of antidepressive effects in rodents in, the forced swim test. So like you said, the mechanism of action is, it's still yet unknown for these compounds. But I think, the research out there certainly is pointing in the right direction across a wide range of indications.
That's so fascinating that it's not only teaching us more about our brains, but about animal brains too,
Yeah.
Those rats could be so much more conscious than we ever gave them credit for. I think that's a really fascinating part of all of this as well. Man, this has been a really fascinating conversation. One of the last questions I wanted to ask you was just, I know DMTs, and you talked about psilocybin, has really affected your trajectory and your pathway and all of this. Do you think that people in this space people that are in, producing psychedelics or working in industry should at least have one psychedelic experience in their, as a part of their, experience to move things forward? Do you think that's necessary or maybe not?
I think psychedelics, you might want to cut this out. I'm trying to think of the right answer.
That's okay. Yeah.
I think psychedelics maybe aren't for everyone. Obviously they are helpful for people with various mental illnesses. However, a lot of these clinical studies that have been going on now, they're omitting, a fairly substantial patient population, whether it be with heart abnormalities, prior mental health illnesses, you name it. So, I honestly do believe they're going to be beneficial for anyone and everyone. And, I'm not going to sit here and say that everyone who needs to undergo the research needs to take psilocybin, MDMA, DMT. In some ways, I do think it is beneficial, though, to understand it. If you look at MAPS, for instance, I believe they're making all their facilitators or administrators of the drug actually have the experience, so they're better able to communicate with their patients. And certainly in that setting, I do think it's helpful, because you just can't necessarily wrap your mind around it unless you've had the experience with it.
And even then, and even then, it's hard to wrap your mind around it, you know. But yeah, I absolutely, I get what you're saying. One of the things I just thought of, actually, it would be cool to get your take on before we jump off, is when you talk about MAPS and some of these organizations and the research and the trials that they've done, I can't help but notice how strategic they've been in their research. You know, a lot of, you know, things like PTSD or treatment-resistant depression, PTSD in particular, it's a human condition, you know, something we can all suffer from, not just first responders, not just people in the military or veterans. But the research has definitely been kind of biased to sample these people with probably a political motivation to help it kind of win bipartisan political support. How do you think this research at this point, do you think it's been successful? Do you think that they're so far pretty successful in their strategy? And then do you hope to see this research be expanded to include, you know, the wider spectrum of the human population?
Yeah, I mean, look, their results kind of speak for themselves. So, I mean, you know, at some level with clinical trials, you kind of have to be selective with the people that you include. You know, whether that's political or strictly medical, you know, I'll leave that to another interpretation. But, you know, again, I think, you know, traumas are out there and everywhere. And, you know, the pandemic that we're going through now, I think, you know, some of these are going to be exacerbated. So whatever we can do to increase acceptance and availability, you know, I think that's what needs to be done.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, I know it's, you know, the contributions of people like yourself and us having conversations like this that are going to help, you know, destigmatize and raise awareness and, you know, hopefully push all the right buttons to make this accessible for the whole world.
Yeah, and I mean, we're off to a pretty good start. So, I mean, you know, onwards and upwards.
Absolutely. Chris, do you, I always give my guests the last word. If you have any thoughts or anything you wanted to share with our audience, and definitely let them know where they can find out more about you and Psilera. That would be great before we jump off.
Yeah, so, you know, if you want to reach out to me directly, my email is chris@psilera.com, PSILERA.com. To think about it. Maybe we can edit that part out.
Maybe. Okay.
Shit.
happens to everybody.
Okay. Let me take another crack at that one if you don't mind, Gaurav.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, if you want to reach out to me directly, my email is chris@psilera.com, PSILERA.com, or just visit our website and see what we're up to. We're constantly putting out updates of some of our research and new collaborations. And, you know, if you'd like to follow along with our journey, feel free to reach out. You know, I would say, obviously, I've mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic and, you know, how this is, I think, kind of brought a lot of the mental illnesses and isolation, and kind of once you have isolation, that typically leads to substance abuse, which we're kind of seeing now. So in some ways, you know, I think the timing of some of the research that myself and some of the other industry is doing is very worthwhile. And you know, I'd hate for this to be kind of the spark that really, you know, changed the perceptions of these compounds and mental health in general. But I mean, again, it's a really exciting time to be a researcher and to be involved in this industry. You know, the data that we had 50 years ago in the 60s and 70s, now we have modern day technology that we can actually image these compounds, figure out how they work in the brain, and utilize them to, you know, make beneficial therapies, hopefully for specific populations, but for the greater community as well. And, you know, it's going to take the whole industry in order to come together to really put the right image on these compounds, because unfortunately, all it takes is one bad outcome of, you know, maybe an at-home use or whatever. And, you know, I think that really can be a negative aspect to the industry. So, you know, let's come together as a community, as an industry, and as a civilization to really put ourselves in a better position for the future.
That was an amazing point. And you're right. We all want to do it correctly this time and learn from, what transpired in the 60s and 70s, because this medicine has immense potential. And yeah, I think we're both really excited to see it move forward. So thank you so much for your time, Chris. I really appreciate it. This is a really great conversation, and I look forward to speaking with you, with Jackie, and just seeing all the progress you're going to make at Psilera in the future.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a great conversation. Happy to answer any more questions offline or online. So thanks again, Gaurav.
Awesome. Thanks so much. All right. Thanks, everybody. I'm Gaurav Dubey, and this has been another great episode of the PsyFi podcast, where we speak with leading industry researchers, clinicians, and experts to unravel the mystery that is psychedelic medicine. Thank you all so much.
All right. Take care.
All right. Thanks so much, Chris. Talk to you soon. All right.
Thanks for joining the PsyFi series, brought to you by Microdose and the Conscious Fund. Visit our website at www.microdose.buzz.